This is part 2 of a series on the Compromise of 1850. Big focus is on finishing the Fugitive Slave Law portion of the presentation. Fugitive Slave Law also is in effect expanded. It expanded the domestic slave trade by rewarding fugitive slave hunters from capturing freed Negroes and selling them at slave auctions in the South. There was 250,000 in the North. Often the burden of proof as to their status in their legal status, the burden of proof was on them to prove status. And for this reason, thousands of freedmen are going to ultimately be sold into slavery. Now, to fight one tool of opposition that abolitionists use to oppose this law would be the passing of personal liberty laws. Personal liberty laws were passed by a number of states that allowed for jury trials to give escaped slaves a trial by jury. These jury trials often resulted in the acquittals and these runaway slaves from being freed. And also, the personal liberty laws were designed to forbid state authorities from cooperating with federal authorities in the capture and return of fugitive slaves. Chief Justice Roger Taney ruled in Prigg versus Pennsylvania that the states cannot pass personal liberty laws that prevent the federal government from enforcing federal law. And so it upheld the sanctity of the Fugitive Slave Law in Prigg versus Pennsylvania. So overall, the Fugitive Slave Law had a tremendous effect in widening and deepening the anti-slavery impulse in the North. As you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, there is a poster that was, and they were very common, widely distributed. Here you can see this poster is from Boston, okay, where vigilance committees will be established to work to safeguard legitimate runaways and free Negroes, and slave hunters that went into the North in search of free blacks to kidnap and for slaves to catch were often ran into a lot of resistance. As you can see on the far right, this is an image showing Wendell Phillips. Wendell Phillips was called the golden trumpet of abolition. He was known to be one of the most successful orators in the movement. And obviously he benefited, and like Wendell Phillips, benefited from the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law and helping get people involved in opposing it. Another tool used to fight the Fugitive Slave Law had already been around since the 1830s. And that would be the underground railroad networks, which moved runaway slaves, usually in the cover of darkness, from safe house to safe house until they can make it across the Mason-Dixon line or that Ohio River. Now, oftentimes freed slaves through the underground railroad networks work to get to Mexico or to the British Bahamas, where there was no slavery. But ultimately, thousands of runaways ended up finding refuge in Canada, where there was no extradition. So obviously, in Southern newspapers, very common in the 1850s is you would see a number of advertisements, reward posters and advertisements in search of runaways. Here you can see one, runaway from the subscriber on July 27th of July. My black woman named Emily, 17 years of age, well grown, black color, has a whiny voice. She took with one of her dark calico and one blue and white dress, a red corded gingham bonnet, a white striped shawl and slippers. I will pay the above reward if taken near the Ohio River on the Kentucky side, or $300 if taken in the state of Ohio, and delivered to me near Lewisburg. Theodore Williams, August 4th, 1853. So, 54. This is another good story to share with you. You have the Anthony Burns is an escaped slave from Virginia, shipped to Boston. The literate Burns wrote a letter to his brother who was still a slave. That letter was intercepted. The owner learned of Burns's whereabouts and headed north to reclaim his property. In May, Burns was arrested, placed under heavy guard in a federal courthouse. Formed, resolved that, quote, resistance to tyrants is obedience to God. A group of abolitionists tried to rescue Burns in an attack on the courthouse with axes, battering rams, and revolvers. One of the deputies lay dead as the protesters were driven back. Backing up a campaign promise to crack down on aid fugitive slaves, Franklin Pierce ordered several companies of Marines, cavalry, and artillery to Boston. He also sent a U.S. warship to Boston to escort Burns back to Virginia. The Vigilance Committee tried all legal maneuvers to stop the extradition, including raising money to purchase his freedom. By the way, the owner was willing to sell Burns, but the U.S. attorney refused to sanction the sale. On June, Burns was transported to Wharf, while the streets were lined with sullen Yankees standing in front of buildings draped in black, with the American flag hanging upside down. Church bells tolling a dirge to liberty in the cradle of the American Revolution. At the cost of $100,000, the Pierce administration upheld the majesty of the law. The fallout from the Burns story is textile magnate Amos Lawrence said that, quote, we went to bed one night, old-fashioned conservative, compromise Union Whigs, and waked up stark mad abolitionists. The government dropped charges on the leaders of the riot when it became clear that there was no way they were going to find an impartial jury. William Lloyd Garrison publicly burned a copy of the Constitution on the 4th of July while thousands breathed amen to his denunciation of this document as a covenant with death. New England states passed new personal liberty laws in addition to other states, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin, who also passed stronger personal liberty laws in the wake of the Burns issue. Now, what the Fugitive Slave Law also did is it ushered in an era of violence. The slave law eroded the commitment to nonviolence. As Frederick Douglass said in October 1850, the only way to make the Fugitive Slave Law a dead letter is to make a dozen or more dead kidnappers. Newspapers in several communities reported that, quote, the colored people are arming. In Pittsburgh, revolvers, Bowie knives, and other deadly weapons found a ready sale. In Springfield, Massachusetts, a white wool merchant by the name of John Brown, with a glint of a biblical warrior in his eye, organized a black self-defense group, which he named the Gileadites. Northern resistance to the Fugitive Slave Law fed the resentment of the fire eaters, who were still seething over the admission of California. One fire eater said, we cannot stay in the Union any longer with such dishonor attached to the terms of our remaining. The governor of South Carolina assumed that, quote, there is now not the slightest doubt that the state will secede. And the reason why the South doesn't secede in 1850 is because cotton prices were the highest in a decade, and they didn't want to screw that up. The Unionists in the South had enough votes to defeat secession in many of the state conventions. The fugitive slave issue, guys, is a very powerful issue, and it really showcased the immorality. People in the North who I would argue were sheltered. He was in the South. I think in their mind they kind of understood what it was, but really cruelties of slavery came home. No union with slaveholders. Garrison, we talked about Garrison. When Garrison, the editor of the Liberator, he also he believed south from the north. It should be a owning south. So, and this is oftentimes what made William Lloyd Garrison very unpopular in the North, especially amongst the Union. Now, the Ableman versus Booth case, this is also one of our county court cases in which an abolitionist editor in Milwaukee, Sherman, got up a lynch mob, got a group up to go rescue the federal court of violating the Fugitive Slave Law, but the Supreme Court of Wisconsin to free Mr. Booth on the ground that the act was unconstitutional. And so in Ableman versus Booth, a unanimous Supreme Court, state court, to interfere with the Constitution, and a state court cannot declare an act of Congress unconstitutional. The Supreme Court has already affirmed of its constitutionality. This episode, like others at the time, illustrated the significant fact that both North and South seized upon nationalism and states' rights for their own purposes. Neither was a point on which many men could claim consistency. Now, last topic, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Anti-slavery forces found their most persuasive appeal, not in the Fugitive Slave Law, but in the fictional drama of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Slavery, seen through her eyes, subjected its victims to callous brutality at the hands of indulgent masters. The book came out in the spring of 1852, sold more than 2 million copies in the United States during the decade. Stowe claimed that God inspired her to write the book, but in reality, it was the Fugitive Slave Law. Now, the American Slavery as It Is, which was a book written by Theodore Weld, a white abolitionist, is also very significant in influencing Harriet Beecher Stowe to write Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, what makes Uncle Tom's Cabin a great book is the character development, the unforgettable characters that were created. Of course, the protagonists, Eliza and Tom, a wife, a husband and wife, slave couple. A lot of her depictions of slavery are based in her visits that she had made to Kentucky, in observing bondage in Kentucky, her experiences with runaway slaves during the 18 years that she lived in Cincinnati. But this Connecticut woman made the image of Eliza running across the icy Ohio River, or Tom, enduring the beatings of Simon Legree in Louisiana, more real than life for millions of readers. Now, the most loathsome villain in the book was a transplanted Yankee by the name of Simon Legree. And so I think it's significant that she makes the Darth Vader in the book out to be a transplanted Yankee. And he is really noted for his brutality and his inhumane treatment of the slaves that are under his care. Miss Stowe rebuked the whole nation for the sins of slavery, but she aimed the novel at the evangelical conscience of the North. And that's who the audience was. Now, even though of course, in the book, Uncle Tom is martyred. He dies for the sins of slavery. Stowe is going to convert Tom as a Christ figure who comes to earth to die for the sins of man. Like Jesus, he dies in order to save the oppressors as well as his own people. Now, Stowe, this is also in the throes of the Second Great Awakening. Stowe's readers lived in an age that understood this message much better than ours. You know, and at the end of the book, and I really want you to take great care and really contemplate this passage from the book. Really want you to think about it, okay, and the implications it's going to have down the road. She says in the book, he said, as he died to make holy, talking about Tom, as he died to make holy, let us die to make men free. So let those words sink in. The book struck a nerve in the South, as Southern writers wrote books to counter Stowe's depiction of slavery. Southerners were angry that Stowe's depiction of slavery was not accurate. They saw the system in they saw slavery in the South as a positive good. Slavery was very paternalistic, and that slave owners were not callous and they weren't brutal, and they largely treated their slaves very, very well. And they resented Uncle Tom's Cabin. Of course, they tried to ban it, but Uncle Tom's Cabin sold like fire in Charleston and elsewhere. They claimed falsehoods, distortions. A New Orleans newspaper said about Uncle Tom's Cabin, it said, quote, "There never before was anything so detestable or so monstrous among women like this." They even wrote a book, one of these 15 books that were written, Robin, in his cabin in Virginia, in Boston. Those in the South actually have shelter and they're taken care of. That free Negroes in the North are treated much worse than those African Americans living in the South.
Midway through the 19th century, America is entering the modern world. In 20 years, there'll be Levi's jeans, chewing gum, and hot dogs. But the nation is split, being torn apart at the seams, dividing North and South.
Slavery became not simply a political issue, not simply an economic issue, but a moral issue as well. It became the issue that defined North and South in the 1850s.
September 1850. The Fugitive Slave Law brings the brutality of Southern slavery to the North. Now, no African American is safe anywhere.
Gentlemen, you've made a mistake. There's a place of business. I'm gonna tell you my clients. Not a slave, gentlemen.
Fugitive slave law meant that if you were a slave and you managed to escape to the North, your master could come and get you, and you had no recourse. Not only that, if you were a free Negro, they still could sell you down the river.
The search for runaway slaves become a witch hunt. Any African American can be condemned simply with an accusation. Even a free man has no right to a trial by jury. Federal magistrates get $10 to rule them slaves, $5 to set them free. Ordinary people are outraged by the new law. Abolitionist newspapers and literature spread like wildfire. Published in 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin becomes the best-selling book of the century after the Bible. A passionate anti-slavery novel written by Harriet, an unknown housewife from Connecticut. It becomes, for the first time, slavery is the burning issue of the day. As America expands across the continent, North and South face off over each new territory. Will it be slave owning or free?
The Northerners began to see that, wait a minute, they're not going to keep slavery just in the South. They want to take slavery west and to turn the country into a slave country.
Here's a portion of a movie that was made in the 1970s, Uncle Tom's Cabin. I'm going to play a portion of it. It's the final scenes.
Tom? God, Tom! It's me, Christopher. Don't you recognize me? Chris? It's you? Oh, Lord. What have they done to you, Tom? I'm here to buy you back, Tom. I'm gonna take you home. Oh. That's right. Okay. You can do that now. Going through the garden. You sound close. Tell her that I was out of Tom. I surely will. For yourself. Tom? Oh, please don't. Don't die now, Tom. Tom?
So Lincoln meets Harry Bickerstaff during the war. And upon getting here, he says, "So, this is the little lady who made this great big war." And so the power of the Fugitive Slave Law and Uncle Tom's Cabin in leading to the Civil War. Lord Palmerston, the British Prime Minister, claimed that part of the reason why the British did not support the Confederacy during the war was due to Stowe's book. He admired the statesmanship of it. Now, the next video in the series of the Road to the Civil War will cover the Kansas-Nebraska Act, bleeding Kansas, and the formation of the Republican Party. Thank you.